welcome back to Course 2, Methods and Tactics in the No Man Left Behind Self-Paced Training. I'm Brett Clemmer, Vice President with Man in the Mirror, and I'm here with Pat Morley, founder and CEO of Man in the Mirror, David Delk, the president of Man in the Mirror, and Charles Cooper, one of our Man in the Mirror faculty members and pastor of the Vine Church. And in the last session, we talked about how important it was to build allies and leaders in your church to get people connected with your vision and invested in your vision. And in this session, we're going to talk about what a disciple looks like. What kind of man are we trying to produce? Guys, why do you think that's so important to really define exactly what a disciple looks like in our church? Pat?
Well, to begin with, if you're trying to solve the wrong problem, then you can only succeed by accident. So it's good to understand what kind of a man you're trying to produce. Now, in Course 1, we indicated that a good, actionable definition for a disciple, biblical too, is that a disciple is called to live in Christ, equipped to live like Christ, and sent to live for Christ. So called, equipped, sent. Called would be the evangelism, the born-again piece. Equipped would be the spiritual formation, the teaching piece, teaching them to obey everything I commanded you. And then sent would be to live for Christ. It would be service, but it would also be neighbor love and abiding in the word of Christ, all the things that are markers of a disciple.
That's good. That's from 2 Timothy chapter 3 that we come up with that definition.
2 Timothy chapter 3 and verses 15 to 17 and everywhere else in the Bible.
Right. Explicitly there, but everywhere else. That's good.
Yeah, and I think, Brett, it's also so important to be strategic, kind of piggybacking on what Pat said. You know, most ministry in the church takes place because of good-hearted volunteers who have work life and family life and, you know, all the other pressures going on. And they're passionate about a certain ministry or a certain effort they want to get involved in. But you know, who's really thinking strategically about how all of this fits together and how it impacts a man's life?
Right.
And so this session is going to be hopefully help us think a little bit more about not just what might happen by accident if guys happen to get involved in things, but how can we actually have a coordinated effort so that God might actually create the kind of men that we're hoping our church can manufacture, can produce through our discipleship efforts.
And I could probably say it, saying the same thing, but probably just a little differently. Dr. Howard Hendricks made kind of famous the idea that if you shoot at nothing, you hit it every time. And so a lot of churches are just doing that. They're trying to reach everybody, and they're not reaching anyone with the message that they're utilizing. Whereas if they become more specific, begin to focus on a specific group of men that they're trying to reach and doing the things that we desire for them to do, I think they're going to achieve much more success and be much happier.
That's good. I know in my church, I was sitting around with our leadership team a few years ago when we were sort of agonizing over what to plan and why to plan it, and sort of we had to have some of this, we got to have some of that, and finally we were just ready to give up until someone said, well, literally, what kind of man are we trying to, what does a disciple look like in our church? And so we didn't have this exercise yet. We just had to sort of make it up as we went. We started listing the things on the board, and when we realized that's the kind of man that we were trying to produce, all of our efforts became focused on that goal. And I know that this exercise that we're going to do in this session is really going to help these leaders do that as well. And let me tell you guys, you're going to work hard during this session. I'm going to warn you that the matrix that you're going to do, the exercise you do at the end of this session, will bring such clarity, but it's going to be worth the effort that you have to get there. So let's go right into this session. This is what does a disciple look like, defining exactly what a disciple looks like in your church.
Welcome to session 3 of our Methods and Tactics course in the No Man Left Behind Self-Paced Training, as we continue to build this implementation plan for what No Man Left Behind and the model can look like in your church. And as we've talked about vision and also building allies and leaders, now we want to move on to think about what does a disciple actually look like in our church? What is the goal that we're looking at? What's the process going to end up doing, or what's the impact we hope it will have in the life of a man? And we're getting into the details, the nitty-gritty of what we actually do and the engine of the model. You remember we talked about how the No Man Left Behind model is this conveyor belt, and it has these gears or these rollers that kind of keep it moving, that create, capture, sustain model process that we continually implement in the life of our church. And so we want to remember to keep vision at the center, that we're constantly communicating that vision, that every time we describe an activity or event, every time we give a guy a task, every time we we get a chance to tell a man about what God's doing in the life of the men of our church, we're going to do it in terms of the vision. And then we're going to create value for guys to get men who are spiritually inert moving. We're going to find something that they think is valuable or important, and we're going to connect with them at that level. And then we're going to capture the momentum, and that's going to give us a chance to offer them a right next step, something they could actually visualize themselves doing. And then we're going to sustain change in their lives by helping them get into the regular study of God's Word and relationships with other men. And as we think about sustaining, we want to now take a look at really beginning with the end in mind. What do we want to see happen in a man's life? If a guy was in our church for, say, 5 years, and we had him actively involved in our all-inclusive ministry, all the different ways that we're touching his life, what would we want the impact of those 5 years to look like in a man's life? And so we have developed what we call our head, heart, hands chart, and actually adapted it from some other folks that had developed it. And this is a great matrix to help us describe, for our context, what a disciple looks like. And so what we want to do now is we want to give you a chance to kind of understand the concept, and then we want to give you a chance to actually work on what would a disciple look like in your church. So as we think about an all-inclusive perspective, and we're interacting with men in all kinds of contexts, whether they're serving in ministries, whether they're in men's-only activities, whether they're in couples groups or youth experiences or engaged with their children or all these different things we have going on, what are the impacts of those interactions going to be in a man's life, and what would we like them to be? So when we take a look at this head, heart, hands chart, we can see that we have these 3 spheres, actually these 5 relational spheres and 3 aspects of a man's life. So relational spheres of relating to God, his family, the church, the world at large, and kind of inside of his own self, okay? And then when we think about head, we're talking about what does he know intellectually, the knowledge that he has, his heart, what are his passions, his beliefs, and then finally his behavior. What is he actually doing on a daily, week-to-week basis? And using this matrix, we can kind of describe that if we had a man for 5 years, what would he look like as a result of being engaged in the life of our church? So for example, just off the top of our heads here very quickly, you and I could come up with some things to fill this in. It's going to take time to fill it in detail, but just some obvious things. For example, if a man was in your church for 5 years, what is one thing that you would hope that he would know about his relationship, about God? What's one thing you would want him to know about God?
Creator of the universe.
Okay, that God is a creator. Okay. What's something else that you'd want him to know about God? Okay, he's love. God's love, that he's a father, okay? So we could put in here, and you could think even about maybe the characteristics of God or something like that, the character of God. The things that you might want a guy to know, and you could fill in a fairly comprehensive kind of description in that block. Now let's think about what is something, let's go all the way down to behavior, because that's probably the second easiest to fill in. And by behavior, I mean literally things you would see a guy doing. So we have a spy cam, we're following him around, okay? The only thing you can put in one of these boxes is something you can see through that camera. Not what he's thinking, not what he's believing, but what he's doing, okay? So let's think about in relation to his family, you have a spy cam on him, he's in your church for 5 years, what's something you would expect him to do regularly in connection to his family? Okay, spend time with them. Great. Okay, pray with them.
Take them to church.
And maybe even leading devotions or something, right? Okay, taking them to church. Okay, so good. So you can see the kinds of things that we would put in here. All right? Now, and so over here, for example, on the world, we would want a guy, maybe that would involve his work life. So we'd want him to maybe work with excellence. We'd want him to maybe share his faith with people who don't have a relationship with Christ. Up here on the self, we'd want him to understand his standing before Christ, in terms of knowledge. We want him to know that he's a sinner saved by grace, that he is now a saint in God's eyes, that he's clothed with the righteousness of Christ, right? So we're going to have some things that we could put in here. Now, sometimes this belief or passion is one of the harder ones to fill in. So let's take a look at, let's say, church. What is something that you would want a guy to believe or be passionate about with regards to the church if he had been involved in your church life for 5 years? What's something that might fit that?
Evangelism?
Okay, that's more outward towards the world. But what about believing the church itself? Evangelism would be something that you'd want him to have a passion for lost people, the people that don't know Christ. But when we think about, and that's a great example, so one of the things we could put here in the world would be that we'd want him to really understand and be passionate about lost people and the need that they have for the gospel. Okay, we want that to be more than just knowledge that, oh, I know there's people who need Jesus, but we want him to believe that that's important. Okay, and so maybe with regard to the church, we might want him to really believe that it is the family of God, for example. So much so that it dictates some of his behavior, and we might want him to believe that it's a high priority, higher priority than sports or hobbies or other things, so to see it as a true priority. Okay, so you see what I'm getting at. The line here about his heart is going to be more about his beliefs, his passions, his values. Those kinds of things are going to come into play there. And you can see that they're all going to be linked, right? Because you're going to hopefully know certain things, you're going to believe certain things, and you're going to do certain things, and those things are connected to one another. I mean, many times our knowledge ends up informing our beliefs, and our beliefs end up determining and informing our behavior. And so these things are connected. But one of the things we don't want to do, many churches, depending on your tradition, many churches will emphasize this, especially in the evangelical world, right? It's all about our knowledge. We go to class, we learn things, we read books, we sit around and talk about them, we watch video series on leadership training. We do all these things, right? And it can be too much about our knowledge. There's other traditions that maybe it's very much about your behavior. We need to serve the poor. We need to make a difference in our community. We need to have outreach ministries. We need to do all of these kinds of things, and that becomes the absolute priority. And then other traditions, it's kind of maybe more emotional, more passionate. It's more about how you feel and are you into it and all of that kind of thing. And so it's more at this place. We really need to understand the balance of these and how they connect to one another and make sure that our ministry is addressing each of these aspects in a man's life. Okay? Now, the value of this is can become a picture of the goal or the kind of man you're trying to produce. When you complete this exercise with your leadership team, you would have a description of what you're hoping to accomplish in the life of a man. What you hope God does in transforming a man through your ministry would be described on this paper. Now, what that allows you to do is it allows you to do what we call a gap analysis. You'll remember from Course 1, the Foundations course, you have a ministry audit. And you're going to need that ministry audit material to do this gap analysis. Because what happens is we can take a look at this chart, and then we can take that ministry audit. That's where we listed, you remember we listed out all of the things that we were doing that engage men across the wide, deep continuum. And we had all of our ministry efforts on there, like our sports or our daycare and our praise team and our stewardship small groups and our Sunday school classes and our, serving the homeless, everything that we were doing that men are engaged in, we listed somewhere on that sheet, okay? And so now what we can do, and this is the beauty of this, is we can take this chart and we can apply it back against that audit. And we can go one by one. We said this is what we wanted to see happen, okay? This is what the kind of man we're hoping we can produce. Well, let's take a look and see if it's realistic right now that this would actually happen in a man's life. So, for example, we would want, let's say that in terms of the world, this could go a lot of different places, but let's just take money. We could put that we'd want a man to live by a budget or at least understand how to use a budget. Okay? We'd put that in there. So, when we went to this list, we can actually take each of these items and we can say, okay, we say that we'd like a man to understand how to use a budget if he wants one and the importance of it and that kind of thing. Now, let's go to our ministry analysis, our ministry audit. Oh, look, we do Crown Ministries. Oh, look, we do Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University. Neither one of those is a men's ministry activity, right? But they're all inclusive. Guys are getting involved in them. And if they do that, they're going to learn and understand how to do budgeting, okay? So we're going to put a check mark beside that little piece. And we would go around our thing and we'd say, oh, you know what? We have a lot of people in our church that talk about evangelism. We have testimonies of people's lives that are being changed. We have the new members, when they join, they give testimonies. We hear their stories. And so there's a really good chance that a guy who's in our church for 5 years is going to become passionate about people who need Christ. At least we're giving him every chance for that to happen, okay? But maybe we get over here to where we'd say that we wanted a guy to do family devotions, and we're looking at our ministry analysis and our ministry audit. Okay, we have softball team, we have praise team, we have classes, we have small groups, we have, stewardship things, Crown Ministry. I don't really see anything in here that ever really trains a guy or shows a guy how to do family devotions. So this looks like a gap, and so we might put a circle around it. That looks like a gap that we have in our ministry. I mean, it's one thing to say, if we have a guy for 5 years, we'd like for this to happen. We're not doing anything that's going to make it happen. So it's kind of silly to say that that's what we want to have happen when there's nothing really going on that's going to lead to it. And so we have one of two choices at this point with our gap analysis. We can either say that we need to add something, okay, that it gives us a realistic chance of doing this, and try to see if there's a leader who might be passionate about that, who might want to begin some kind of process that would help lead towards that. Or we can say, you know what, right now, where we are in the life of our church, either we don't have the leadership, we don't have the time, we don't have the energy, whatever. This is not as important as we thought it was. But we're not going to leave it out here as just some kind of, wish that somehow magically is going to happen. We're going to either address it or we're going to say, you know what, this is just something that's probably not going to happen right now. And that's okay, we can't do everything. But at least we're being intentional with what we're trying to accomplish and what we're not trying to accomplish in the lives of men. Does that make sense? So you take this chart and you fill it in with your leadership team, describing what a disciple would look like after 5 years in your church. Then you take your ministry audit that gives you all of the different ways that your church is interacting with men. You map them together, check off the ones that are being taken care of, circles around the ones that seem like probably not going to happen. And then the ones that are circled, you're going to go and look at them and say, okay, should we address this or not? Do we have the manpower? Is this a time that God wants us to do this? Are we ready for this? How important is it? All those kinds of things. And this will give you some great feedback about maybe things that you need to add on, or even things that maybe you need to emphasize more, that you have a check mark, but you say, you know what, that could be a lot more effective than it is now. And here's some ways that we can make it even more effective.
In this session, we've been talking about the head, heart, and hands of a disciple. And you've determined what a disciple looks like in your church. What are the most important things and priorities that you have for a disciple's head, heart, and hands based on the context of your church. And that's why I'm really excited about this new tool that we've created called the Journey to Biblical Manhood. What the Journey does is it gives you the ability to bring men through 10 modules. The first 2 are the essentials of biblical manhood and the foundations of faith. And then the next 8 are more topical, things like managing your money and being a good dad and marriage. So let's take the marriage one for an example. What you would do then is you would say, in the area of marriage, go back and look at our head, heart, and hands matrix and determine what are the things that we want a man to know, do, and believe in the area of his marriage. Then you take those things and you create what we call faith and life objectives. These are questions that you could ask men and sort of assess how they're doing in each of those areas. Based on your faith and life objectives, we'll give you a list of curriculum that you can choose from, some from Man in the Mirror, some from other ministries. You pick the one that works best for the faith and life objectives that you've selected. After you've taken your men through the curriculum for that module, you can go back and do the assessment again that you did at the beginning of the module and determine the life change that's happened in the lives of the men that have participated in that module. Think about this. At the end of 10 modules, a man will have gone through all the different curricula, and hopefully they will have been able to cover all the different things, all the different important priorities and concepts that you've listed in your head, heart, and hands matrix. You will have created a disciple using the Journey to Biblical Manhood.
When we talk about sustaining change and the kind of man that we're trying to produce, how is that actually going to happen through the life of our church? What we're going to do now is we're going to give you time to actually work on filling out this chart. We provide one that has got more filled out. It's just a sample. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to give you a little bit more feedback, because I know that this can feel somewhat nebulous. So a little more feedback. And then you, with your leadership team, can fill out the rest of that chart. Then you can take your ministry audit from Course 1 and do this actual analysis where you check off the things that are seem to be covered by some kind of ministry effort that you have going on now, and circle the things that aren't being taken care of. And then as a leadership team, you can decide, how do you want to handle those things? What do you need to emphasize more? What changes might you need to make so that